Just taking a pulse on the room, see how you guys are, see if you're warm enough. Hey, war moms. Getting warmer. You know, I'm going to have to update my Twitter. It still does the thing. In honor of the conference, a long time ago, I had my name was James Lindsay, King of Your Mom. And so in honor of the conference, I have the summit. I'm sorry, I did change it back to that. But apparently now, after Tiffany's introduction, I have to change it to James Lindsay, Lady Killer. Thank you for that. I'll give you $50 later. So I'm going to do what I normally do, which is scare the crap out of you, I think. We're war moms, so we have to be ready to go to war, so we have to understand the battlefield. We have to understand the threats to freedom that we face as parents, that we face as citizens. And there are a number of major ways that freedom can be squished, if you will, by different things going on in society. One of those is the government. We all know about that one. One of those is monopoly capital. We don't think nearly enough about that one. One of them is the church. We don't think much about that one any longer. Ecclesial authority was something that our founders had the good sense to say, we're not going to do that. Let's have a First Amendment that leaves freedom of conscience to you. Your belief is a matter that the state will not compel, which prevents the church from getting too much power over anybody and allows pluralism of belief and allows the prevention of an episcopate telling you what to do. And the fourth is this weird thing that got a name in the 1920s called hegemony, which is sort of the prevailing cultural attitude where they bully you in the street if you don't agree when it gets out of control. So there's these kind of four big threats to freedom. And the First Amendment really does, like I said, it kind of contains the potential for destroying your freedom from ecclesial authority and also actually from cultural hegemony. A lot of immigrants to this country have bragged that one of the things they love about it is that it's a country where you can tell the President of the United States, let's go Brandon. You don't have that in a lot of countries. We all heard from Heavy D this morning, and if you don't like him, you can tell him to let's go Brandon too. We have that freedom here. This is the First Amendment that also prevents both faith and from hegemony from taking over too much power and squishing out the possibility of freedom for citizens. The government is also supposed to be restrained. Supposed to be, but that's been slipping a lot. Monopoly capital, we have a little bit of a harder time containing, but we do have antitrust laws and things that we came up with about a century and a half late to control that problem, sort of. So now I have to tell you, what we're going to do is we're going to zoom out to understand why in the world I'm saying all this abstract stuff like this, and I'm not talking about Paulo Freire, which you know I'm going to talk about soon. We're going to get to him, I promise. We're going to zoom out like this new telescope. The Webb telescope comes out, it sees 4.6 billion light years out into the universe. Immediately, the left calls it homophobic because it's not looking at them. I mean, it is. That's the problem. It's not looking at them. That's what it's about. And I want to zoom out almost to that degree, not quite 4.6 billion light years, but I want to go to the biggest macro. So I want to talk about one of my favorite Germans who I've popularized for all of you people by the name of Klaus Schwab. Boo! Yes, Klaus Schwab actually comes into this story. So he wrote this charming book this year called The Great Narrative. Because we have to have a great narrative to tell us how to be, apparently. And it's, of course, that there's existential threats all around us, if you wondered what the great narrative is, like climate change and all these other things. And so we need to come together in cooperation and give all the power to them to manage the great threats. That's the great narrative that we have to now instill in everybody. But in that book, he says we're going to have this great mechanism to do this. It's going to be called Environmental, Social, and Governance Metrics, ESG scores. And we're going to apply them to corporations using both government power and financial power from the big banks. So if corporations don't want to get on board, we have this top-down power. Government and corporation in a public-private partnership will come together. He says in our free liberal democracies, we don't really like the idea of public-private partnerships because the actual word for that is fascism, which is diametrically opposed to a free liberal government. But he says we're going to have to get used to it. But if that's not the case, he says, if that doesn't work, if we can't just force this top down, he says we're going to make a bottom-up demand. He talks a lot about the millennials and Generation Z. And he talks about how they're already demanding a different world. They already want an entirely different world to live in. And so he says if the corporations don't want to go along with it and they even want to resist this top-down power, which I could talk about for 2 hours if you want, because it's an evil, evil plan that they've got and how it works. He says it doesn't matter because their customers, their clients, their employees from the new generation will demand it. They will demand compliance. They will demand a new world with new values. And so now we're looking at this cobbling together of corporate power and state power to be able to accomplish what neither can do on its own. I want you to kind of have as a refrain in the back of your head for the rest of your life, basically, that what they can't accomplish through the front door of government, they're going to try to accomplish through the back door of corporations until we stop them from doing that. This is going to apply to everything. But the thing is, Klaus is talking about a bottom-up movement that's going to demand this in case that top-down program fails, and how is he going to get it? Well, you have to educate the young people with new values. Just like the critical Marxist Herbert Marcuse wrote in the 1960s, we have to interject new values to create a new sensibility and a new rationality to create a new reality. That's in the section titled A Biological Foundation for Socialism, in that essay, by the way. So we have to interject new values into people. And it's hard to interject new values into stupid old people. You have to get them into the kids. It's a lot easier. The kids don't know different. Lenin, who has been fashioned into a bust that sits on the bookcase behind Klaus Schwab in his office, Vladimir Lenin, said, "You give me the child for 4 years and I'll plant a seed so deep you'll never uproot what comes out of it." Hitler said, "What are you? You're going to pass away. I have your children." They understand this. Mao Zedong in China reorganized not just the entire education system, but the entire society to become an education system to instill its values, but he focused on a youth movement. Klaus Schwab says we need social emotional learning. And the point of social emotional learning is to teach the children not to be able to survive in a world, not to be able to be psychologically competent. That biological foundation for socialism, Marcuse tells us in a footnote, means the psychological foundation. To not be able to be psychologically competent to live in a world that's not ESG compliant. So they've got to brainwash the kids, and I don't mean brainwash in some cute way. I mean brainwash in the sense of the word xinao, which is in Mandarin, which is literally what the Maoist prisons referred to as their program of thought reform, brainwashing. Xinao means wash brain. If you ever have to go to the bathroom in China, it's shishoujian, which that means hand wash room. You go to the hand washing room. So she is wash, now is brain. Xinao, brainwash. We didn't come up with a cute term. The Chinese actually called it that. And that's what social emotional learning, that's what our education system has become. A program of Maoist-style thought reform in order to install the demand for ESG compliance in the future generation. That's why our friend Mr. DeSantis talked about both of these powers, by the way, the government and the corporations. He mentioned our favorite other D word, Disney. This is why Disney wants to do what Disney did. He talked about what a risk it was, how stupid it seemed. How on earth would you want to die on this hill, he said. ESG score went up. That's why. Disney, with its children's entertainment programming, is integral to the program of instilling new values into children. And Paulo Freire is still going to come into the story, I promise, because the goal is that you have to make the children see the ideas so then they'll start asking the questions, not of the parents, but of the teachers, of the state institutions. And if you introduce those ideas, then they'll ask about it. That's exactly, by the way, the justification that you'll hear. Why are these books in the libraries? Why are there courses teaching pornography? Not about it as a concept. Teaching porn studies. Why do these exist? That's in college still for the moment, by the way, not high school yet. Why do these exist? because children already encounter it in the world. They're on the internet. They see pornography, so we have to teach them about sex and sexuality all the way down to pre-K. That's actually the justification they give. If they're not watching pornography on the internet, hopefully, they saw it on Disney anyway. And so they're going to come in and they're going to ask the question. This is what Paulo Freire, so now we turn to this weird Brazilian. This is what Paulo Freire called a generative theme. And his whole program of education is based on generative themes. So last night, a lot of you guys will have met Alvin from Courage is a Habit. He's here. He and I had an encounter. Turns out he's an illusionist, which is a word that means a real-world magician without any actual magic powers, though I'm not quite convinced. He did some really weird things with cards, and it's so strange. You wouldn't believe it. I got back to my room last night, opened up my wallet, and there was a Queen of Hearts in there and no money. I don't know how that happened. No, I'm just kidding. But the Queen of Hearts was involved, and he literally made it appear out of a vase or something over here. Absolutely beautiful. And we were having this really interesting discussion that what happens in an illusionist's trick is that they're doing sleight of hand, but also what you might call sleight of mind. They have the skills of, here comes a $5 word you haven't heard in a while, prestidigitation. But they also have the skills of misdirection. They get you to look in the wrong places. They get you to not see something that if you would have saw it, you would have said, aha, I know what you did. I know how that Queen of Hearts got in my wallet. Give me my 20 back. And that's what's actually happened with Paulo's generative themes. He's enabled the theft of education. And I want you to understand that education has been stolen from us so that people like Klaus Schwab can have their agenda, using your children as pawns. And the method that they seized upon was that of Paulo Freire with his generative theme. So you probably have had this experience. You've probably said there's critical race theory in this school. Mr. DeSantis talked about the books, and then he even referred to the fact they say, no, it's only taught in law school. We don't have a critical race theory course in 5th grade or whatever. And you say, no, it's right here. You're doing the oppressor-oppressed thing. You're doing the whole white privilege thing. You're talking about equity. I know what I'm seeing. You're talking about creating change agents to change the world, to transform the world. You've probably had this, and they say, well, that's not really critical race theory. That's just teaching honest history or whatever. And you'll say, no, this is really critical race theory. You'll see some weird math lesson, and you'll say, all of the statistics problems they're teaching to juniors in high school in their statistics class are about race and poverty statistics. And you're like, I know the trick you're pulling. This trick is called the generative themes trick. The drag queen at Drag Queen Story Hour, according to the paper they wrote about themselves, is a generative moment. What they're doing with Disney, with the groomer content, is a generative moment. The goal is to find emotionally resonant conversation on important socially relevant issues and to bring that up as the topic of education in the guise of other education. Paulo Freire looked for the generative terms that he knew would radicalize people in the different contexts that they were in, whether it's post-colonial Brazil, whether that's as he went around the world later as a Marxist, looking at anything that he could agitate people into seeing the society that they're in is unjust and unfair and in ultimate need of a cultural revolution to overthrow it. He says that explicitly over and over again in his books. And he talked to these people that he was going to teach. He said, well, I'm going to be your adult literacy teacher. I'm going to teach you to read. And his method is that you use the generative themes. You talk to the people to find out what their problems are, and you're going to extract generative themes, and those are the words you're going to teach them to read. So if it's slum, suffering, starvation, exploitation, whatever it happens to be, those are the words you're going to select to teach them to read on the basis that they turn out to be A, culturally relevant to their situation, and B, engaging. You've heard these excuses. Culturally relevant teaching is this method repackaged. Then you do a little bada bing, bada boom. We'll talk about that in detail. We'll get to the micro here in a minute. And on the other side, you reconnect the people to the vision that you have implanted them about their situation. And then they're so inspired by this that they want to read more about it, so they basically learn to read. Although in experiment, it doesn't work. When you take this, say there's an experiment done in 2007, they took this to Nigeria to see what would happen. I would love to read it to you if I had it in front of me. Go listen to the podcast. Turns out it didn't work. By the time that they had engaged the people with the words that made them upset, they just became upset. They said that the students became emotional wrecks. All they did is scream for change, change, change. They accused the people that were there to teach them of being part of the system that was exploiting them. And they said that they didn't even see the purpose in learning to read any longer. And so you wonder why the kids are all learning to be activists and don't even see the point of wanting to learn academic mastery. It's because that's what the Freirean method is designed to create. And so the way that this works is you data mine your subjects. Maybe it's with surveys today. They have high-tech iPads, so you don't have to go talk to them. Or you talk to them, or you give provocative material like a book in the library that they can go see for themselves and ask a question. Or you give them provocative material in the sense that you have a drag queen come and read them a story, and there's an academic paper about that, and the last sentence of that paper is that their objective with Drag Queen Story Hour, by the way, in their own words, is to leave a trail of glitter in the carpet that will never come out. That's exactly what they say their objective is. To leave a trail of glitter in the carpet, that's your kids, that will never come out. We all know how hard it is to get glitter out of anything. So you agitate to get these ideas, or you data mine to get these ideas, and they're surveying your kids relentlessly to get them. This should look very familiar. Then you feed them back in emotionally provocative ways in order to stimulate political conversation in the guise of a different lesson. And that's the theft of education. That's the magic trick, where all of a sudden the 8 of hearts became the Queen of hearts. You thought it was a math lesson, and it's a politics lesson. See, because Paulo Freire said that the point of education is actually not to teach people to read, it's to read their political context. Academic mastery is secondary, he says, as a fundamental human right to learning to read the political context, to becoming politically literate. In fact, true literacy means political literacy, and for a Marxist, political literacy means seeing the thing in the Marxist way. So the goal is to use every subject. This is why it's so hard to get these subjects out of the schools. This is why laws being passed are necessary but clumsy, is because they are going to present critical race theory through Ruby Bridges and statistics lessons. They're going to present the sexuality stuff through just these conversations that just happen to come up. Well, I just happened to mention, my dating life, and then the kids wanted to know all about it. And they just happened to mention it, and it just happened to come up. And then we read a book about it, and then they had more questions. Maybe they wanted to find out about what it's like to be a drag queen. The Drag Queen Story Hour paper says that's one of the objectives that they have, is to get them to want to find out what that's like, with the deeper objective of getting them to question the idea of sex, gender, sexuality completely at its fundamental levels, to complicate those ideas, to question the idea that our society was founded to be for everybody. Then maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was racially biased. Maybe it was sexually biased. Maybe it was biased in terms of gender identity, which obviously Thomas Jefferson had never thought about because it exists for like 50 years after a weirdo pedophile named John Money made it up. The point is to turn your regular curriculum into a politics curriculum. And when you see the magic trick, this is what Alvin and I talked about last night, it's not magic anymore. In fact, it's just kind of technical and a little bit boring. So for me, we ended our conversation with, I don't want to see how you did it. He wasn't going to tell me anyway, obviously, but I don't want to see it. I wanted to keep the magic, but I'm an adult and can make that decision. If I'm a child, I can't, and that's what they're doing, and that's why they're targeting the children. And the goal of bringing this stuff in is to agitate, is to create chaos, is to create division, and is to create, as you've heard if you've listened to my Groomer Schools podcast or listened to about any of my talks this year, a funnel that pushes kids into the sex, gender, sexuality identities overwhelmingly. Critical race theory is like 5% of the problem. Queer theory is like 45% of the problem. It's that much bigger. Because there's 3 main purposes to what they're doing with this sex, gender, sexuality stuff that they're doing in the schools. The first one is when you sexualize kids, and Marxists have known this for 100 years. George Lukács and the Hungarian Empire figured this out, or regime, the Soviet regime that they had in Hungary for 4 months, figured this out, that if you sexualize the children, you can achieve a new society. And there are 3 main reasons. The first thing you do when you sexualize children is you destabilize them. It is not developmentally appropriate for children to have their fundamental categories of man, woman, or whatever, boy, girl, complicated to where they can't be understood without somebody telling them what the right answers are. That's what social emotional learning does, by the way, right? They introduce this complicated topic, and then they tell them how they're supposed to feel about it. They engineer their emotions for them. You are destabilizing the children because they become moldable entities that you can shape into whatever purposes you want, like becoming change agents and activists when they decide that the world that they inhabit is fundamentally unfair to them or people that they've been brought up to esteem. Secondly, you get them to sever the ties to their family. You make your kid a little sexual weirdo, they come home, they talk to mom, that's you, and you're like, what? I don't want you to talk, wait, what? And it's, Mom, you don't understand me. You don't know. Things are different. It used to be different. Everything was oppressive because that's the word the school used to describe how things used to be like 15 minutes ago. According to Paulo Freire, whatever actually is now is already oppressive. He says you actually cannot know the thing you want to implement because you'll impose it on people, and that's right wing. You can't possibly know where you're going. You just continue to agitate. So what you do is you destabilize the individual and you get them to cut off from their family, but they're also going to cut off from their faith because faith is holding timeless values. So they're going to tell you that the Bible, say in the book of Genesis, doesn't know what it's talking about when it says God created them man and woman. That's old-fashioned, that's patriarchal, that's oppressive, that's homophobic, like the space telescope. And you're confused and you're like, what? And they're like, Mom, you don't understand. What the communists realized 100 years ago is that you can, by sexualizing children, you can sever a child from his own sense of stability. He has to grow up within boundaries, has to develop and understand the world bit by bit as he matures. You can sever them from himself, you can sever them from the roots they have in their family, and you can sever them from the prevailing faith that might ground them and set them in the right direction. And that's why they're doing it. That is why they are correct. I should say Ron DeSantis is correct. They are actively going after to harm your children. And it is a purposed program to make them introjected with new values to support an ESG-driven world that will be an entirely new economy that they're being educated with the education of the future in order to be the cadets to fill. That's actually what's happening. And education has been stolen from you by this generative themes method. So what you can do when you understand what this generative themes method is first of all, you're going to see if you look at anything in education, you're going to see the word generative all over the place. And you're going to say, oh no, because now you understand what it is. You're going to also be able to understand and articulate if you go to a school board or if you go to a superintendent or if you go to a lawmaker, this is how they're doing it. You're not going to go find like the critical race theory primer in most books, unless you're in California. Apparently they're literally making high school students read it there now. You're probably not going to find it. What you're going to find is some book that's being used inappropriately to generate the theme to have the discussion. And so what that requires is not even just curriculum transparency, but some means of checking up and seeing what the teacher's actually doing with the curriculum when they bring it up in class. What kinds of classroom conversations are happening? What kinds of conversations are inappropriate? Should we be talking about our personal relationships as teachers with children like they're your buddies? No, absolutely not. And so these are the kinds of things that you have to understand, because what Freire said is that this is what you have to do for education. You have to get inside, you have to get the context that they are in, you have to find specifically emotionally and socially relevant words and terms to their lives that will evoke a response when fed to them, and then you feed them back to them in a mode. You ever hear that word problematic? Turns out his stages after that are you give them back the ideas that you mined from them in data mining. Once you give them back to them, you then, they give them in codified form. You begin to decodify. You take the code written out of them so they can understand that thing. And the first thing is you teach them to read it through a lens of oppression. The second thing you do is you teach them to problematize the society that allows that to occur. And the third thing you do is you bring that back to make it personal so they find themselves as the person who experiences that form of oppression. That's the system. Now, I want to read something to you, actually. I haven't read anything in a talk in a long time, and hopefully I'll find it very quickly. I took a screenshot so I wouldn't lose it. So I'm just going to read I'm going to read this paragraph to you, and then I'll tell you what it is afterwards. It says, this is about two guys. Neither of these men had himself initiated the drama. Indeed, at first both had resisted it and tried to remain quite outside of it. But their environment did not permit any sidestepping. It's almost like they're a captive audience, like at school. They were forced to participate, drawn into the forces around them until they themselves began to feel the need to confess and reform. This penetration by the psychological forces of the environment into the inner emotions of the individual person is perhaps the outstanding psychiatric fact of thought reform. Now, brainwashing. The milieu began to bear upon the prisoner a series of overwhelming pressures, at the same time allowing them only a very limited set of alternatives for adapting to those pressures. In the interplay between person and environment, a sequence of steps or operations, a sequence of combinations or manipulations and responses takes place. All of these steps revolve about two policies and two demands: the fluctuation between assault and leniency, or you might say criticism and love bombing, and the requirements of confession and re-education. The physical and emotional assaults bring about the symbolic death. Leniency and the developing confession are a bridge between death and rebirth. The re-education process, along with the final confession, creates the rebirth experience. And you're like, wow, that's a book about social emotional learning. It is not. It is a chronicle of the psychiatric fact of brainwashing in the Chinese Maoist prisons. So I want to let you have a question, and I want you to sit with it. I want you to sit with it a lot over the next weeks and months. If you knew, because everybody's like, James, what do we do? If you knew you were sending your children for 30 to 35 hours a week to a Maoist thought reform prison, a Maoist brainwashing prison, if you thought that that's what was really occurring, what would you do differently? The answer to that question, whatever it is for you, is the answer to James, what should we do? Because under social emotional learning, and this is what you must understand. Under social emotional learning, you are sending your children to a thought reform program embedded into the curriculum, the existing curriculum of the education. The goal with social emotional learning, as it has evolved from a personal responsibility model, this is another talk, to a participatory civics model, into now what they call a transformative model, has also evolved from intervening with individual identified targeted interventions with children who had demonstrated problems, to bringing it in as a curricular element, to what they now call systemic social emotional learning, which is infusing it into every aspect of not just the school, but ideally the life experience of the children. Every class, math class, taught through social emotional learning. History class, social emotional learning. Football coach, social emotional learning. Klaus Schwab, in his 2016 white paper about the future of education, says they're even piloting in France a program where they teach nurses social emotional learning, specifically to go work with pregnant mothers to teach them to start social emotional learning their children from birth. And that's the direction that they want this to go. Social emotional learning everywhere, all the time, every age, every possible curricular piece that you can have. So what they're doing is they're stealing the curriculum and infusing something new into it so that it does something different. They're taking the literacy lesson and making it a political literacy lesson. They're taking the numeracy lesson and making it a political numeracy lesson. And your kids are not going to learn to read and write. Our favorite twerker on the internet and the state senator in Rhode Island, Tara Mack, recently bragged about, after the shooting in Texas, bragged about how she got hundreds of students to go lie down on she participated in, probably the teachers got them to do it, go lie down on a die-in on the steps of the Providence, Rhode Island State House, and she says, when are we going to have whatever gun policies that she wants as a communist? And then she gets pointed out, however, immediately thereafter, that in Providence, only 6% of the children can do math at grade level, and only 14% of the children can read. They can't read. They can't do math. I'm sure they're historically completely ignorant. They don't know what American civics are because they think laying on the State House steps is how you make change. and yet they know how to be political activists, and they know that right now, whatever the thing is in the news is the thing they have to go take action on. And that's the model that they have. That's why when the space telescope goes out and takes a picture, they say it's homophobic immediately. They don't know what else to do. It's the only thing they know how to do. They have no other context. So this is how education has been stolen, and the purpose is to fuel a gigantic public-private partnership between corporate and state power so that they have absolute control, not necessarily over you. What are you? You will pass away. We have your children. Again, to paraphrase Adolf, in whose mold they're operating. So what do? First of all, take hope. Don't freak out. Breathe, Mom. We just saw Casey DeSantis sit here and do what moms do, which was to deliver a crazy, on-point, perfectly concentrated, not a blip, better than I can talk message while handling a 5-year-old with the other hand. You all are moms. You have the capacity to handle a bunch of toddlers who think space telescopes are homophobic and drag queens with the other hand while you deliver a pointed political message that starts to change America back. So take hope. But what you have to do is you have to understand what you're working with, what you're up against. You have to understand that you, whether public or private, except in rare cases with private schools, are sending your children to Maoist thought reform prisons. And you have to ask yourself what you're going to do as a result. There are several answers I want you to keep in mind, and it's up to you what you do with them. Take them out. Work on deprogramming them every day. Make them immune to it so that they can flip it over when they grow up. Those are all options. So are taking all kinds of dedicated action to fix this system, to get this crap able to be seen and identified for the crime against humanity that it is, and pulled out of the schools. And like I said, you're war moms. You got this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me here. Sure. No, I hate being on the spot.
So we have about 10 more minutes. We were going to scratch doing questions with James, but we have about 10 minutes. So we're going to do questions. I know the AV team is probably scrambling because I'm doing this to them right now. Can we get 2 mics in the audience?
I've got a mic to start. So we can start with this.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
We'll start right there.
You do not have to stand up. Your mic.
Oh, there's one here.
Okay. Oh, mine is super simple. I absolutely love what you said, and it's like a coalesce of so many different things. How do we hear it again? Like, what's the next step to hear this over and over? One of your books, get on your pod, like, how I can just
actually, I'm going to
it.
stand up since I thought we were going to just like chat. Okay, it's really weird for me just like, hey, lady killer. So there are a lot, I mean, as for how do you hear that exact thing again, that's up to the ladies here at Moms for Liberty, so ask them. I have no idea. There's cameras, so it's somewhere, and that's up to them. But if you want to hear more of what I have to say, I actually have a workshop coming up in DC at the end of the month. It's pretty soon. I'm going to cover Paulo Freire in 4 lectures in pretty much a lot of detail. But I have about 8, if you can't make it to DC, I totally understand. I have about 8 billion podcasts talking about this issue now. On my website, which is at newdiscourses.com, you can go to the New Discourses podcast. I actually am reading Paulo Freire's books as podcasts and explaining where it all comes from and reflecting it against older Marxist literature and this thought reform literature and so on. So you can actually have the deepest dive that you want. And if you say, wow, I don't want to listen to like literally the 90 hours of podcasts you've done on this, maybe you could listen to the short ones, which I call New Discourses Bullets. So there is that. And following the workshop, I'm finishing actually a book about the Paulo Freire stuff that should be out maybe by the end of summer. I'm hoping by the end of August to have that out. So stay tuned. That book will be called, just like the workshop is called, The Marxification of Education. And I want to lay out exactly how Paulo Freire stole education from us and what we can do to take it back.
Wonderful. James's keynote is live streamed, and we'll have it up on our website. Another question?
So a lot of teachers that I've worked with in the last couple of years, they genuinely believe that this stuff is really good for their kids, and it's not done with malice. They think they're on some kind of religious crusade for kindness or some other word they fill in. So when I'm talking to these teachers and they think they're doing the right thing, how do I communicate to them that what they're doing is genuinely malicious when they think, like the converted zealot, that they are so correct?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I don't want to impugn even teachers as converted zealots in a lot of cases. I think that most of them are actually genuinely naive. Some of them are not. But most of them are genuinely naive to what they're implementing. They think that they're implementing the right thing because guess what? In the previous generation of education, it worked on them. And it will work on your children just like it worked on them as they go in a kind of multi-generational step-by-step program to implement it. So, you know, you have to kind of convince them that they have a certain worldview, but that's not easy. One of the things that I've been playing with, I was talking about this yesterday at lunch, and I was like, I don't know how to talk about this in public, so maybe I'll just say it now. I've found that giving kind of metaphors to the two different ways of seeing things can kind of help. And the one that I stumbled upon the other day is that their worldview is, you know, that kindness is basically the systemic phenomenon that happens because the society is accommodating everybody else because the space telescope is looking at them instead of out into space. And you have to start asking questions. You're like, do you think that this is really the best way to go? And one of the things that I've found is a metaphor that's connecting a little bit with some people that I've tested it on is I've said, you know, it's like if you went out and you got a cut, like you're working out on the farm or whatever, I guess, and you cut yourself on the barbed wire and it gets a little bit infected. So what you have to do is there's two ways to look at the problem. It gets infected, it's swollen up, I won't get gross with you, but it's red, it's inflamed, you know, that's important. And so you go to the doctor, and the doctor can say, okay, you got this cut, we're gonna have to put this like antibiotic ointment on it or whatever, we're gonna clean it up and we're gonna stitch you up or whatever it happens to be, and it'll get better, the body will heal. That would be following the facts and common sense, as Ron DeSantis said it. Now, what this worldview is rooted in is the systemic thinking worldview. And they will recognize the idea of thinking structurally or thinking systemically. And if they're Freirean, they've already learned that the point of education is to learn to think structurally. That's exactly what he says it is to see the structural conditions underlying phenomena in the world. What you can say is, well, if you went to the doctor and it was a structural doctor, they would say, well, you have this red swollen thing. I won't say the nasty words. And so that's actually because of your immune system. Your immune system is reacting to it. So the best thing to do would be to put you on immune suppressants. That's actually what's happening here. It is, rather than to engage with these things in the ways that we know that they actually are, that these are personal issues, there are, you know, social issues, that there are challenges, that there are political issues, that we have to be able to look at through the lens of understanding, if we want to get fully philosophical, that we are rational beings who can understand something of our world but not everything. That we switched gears now into saying that no, everything is the system's problem, the system's fault. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to mess with the system in order to try to make things better. Like with equity, it's not equitable, for example, to have special talented and gifted classes. So what we're going to do is get rid of those. That we're going to fix the system by actually suppressing the immune system. We're going to suppress critical thought about what is going on with sex, gender, sexuality instead, and tell people what the right answers are so that they have the thing that conforms to the social emotional learning lesson. And so rather than having an immune system that's letting people figure this stuff out, thinking through it in a concrete way, we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to think in terms of the system being the problem. And it's very much like, so what you have to do when you want to intervene with people is ask questions. How do you see that what you're advising is different than suggesting, you know, we're going to use immune suppressants, or we're going to give you systemic antibiotics or something like that instead, like the wrong, or chemotherapy or something, the wrong treatment for the disease that might be very real. There might really be actual, like kids, frankly, I know we're all moms and we love them, but we all know that they're jerks. And so they are really little jerks to each other a lot of the time. So there probably is a lot of calling names and being very inappropriate and not knowing those boundaries yet. So they can point at the real cut, but the question is, how do you actually solve the problem that's there? And the suppressed immune system to get rid of the immune response is probably not a good one, because the whole body is going to get sick as a result. And so kind of prying in with those kinds of questions and trying to get them to realize that the systemic structural thinking cannot, at best, if it can even diagnose the problem, it cannot prescribe the cure, because it thinks about the problem in the wrong way. The system is not the problem in the broad picture of how we deal with these issues. It is, in fact, the individuals need to be brought up within structures and learn how to navigate life. So I would try by kind of prying up, mind-opening type questions of that sort.
Hi there. I am a follower of yours on Twitter. I love your account. I have noticed the last little while you have been against school choice, and I haven't really seen any explanation, and I don't know if that has anything to do with what you've talked about today, or if you could just give us a quick explanation of why.
Okay, I was hoping not to have to do this. Security is still here, right? This isn't going to be popular. I'm real worried about school choice. I'm really nervous about it. I know a lot of people see it as kind of this, Hail Mary pass or the solution or part of the solution, and I don't disagree that it is a necessary. I think it's what education should look like in the long term. What I'm actually concerned about is that we are not prepared to pass through the short term that precedes the long term to get to that long term good thing. And so the belief is that if we open up choice by one means, vouchers, ESAs, or education savings accounts, or whatever else, then we get the money back into the parents' hands, that they're going to be able to make market-based decisions on their kids' education that will force the public schools to behave better, that will give them more options, that will enable new schools or new avenues, and that the whole education system, anything that's toxic and poisonous that people want to get away from, that they will, because right now you're sort of financially trapped because you're paying for the public schools whether you send your kid there or not. So this is the logic behind the school choice, and it's the invisible hand of the market. What I worry about is like what I started my talk saying, so I was actually kind of laying ground for what I didn't want to say, is that there are two fundamental things that we have to worry about that squeeze in on freedom. Say the freedom to choose what school your kids are going to go to. One of those is the state, and one of those is monopoly capital. And I do not think the school choice movement is thinking through either of those things sufficiently to act in the way that it's acting. Let me give you the example. The voucher system, everybody knows that a voucher is a coupon, so the state gets to determine what you spend the voucher on. Obviously, that means when the money follows the backpack, the string is tied to the money, and the kid has a string tied to him that goes right back up to the federal standards. We'll call that the statist model. That can be circumvented with lots of thought, but we have to think about how to do it. There's an awful large slush fund happening in the world of federal education dollars and even state education dollars. Like the state of California, I'm sure, has some wonderful ideas about how education is supposed to be done. Maybe the state of Florida has better ideas. So that's the state tying accountability, not accountability to you, dear taxpayer, accountability to them, and thus whatever they say goes. Like if they want you to only buy woke math books, that's the only thing those voucher dollars will go for. That is a problem that has to be thought through, and that is actually a less hard problem to solve, I think, when you start having things like parents' bills of rights. Monopoly capital is a much harder problem. So just bear with me a minute and see, let's imagine Arizona, which from what I understand has a mostly pretty good school choice law and the ESAs and a very broad definition of what qualifies. Everybody's happy about Arizona. And wouldn't it be really weird if like the McDonald's of schooling moved in and opened up lots of schools in virtually every community, or the Amazon.com of schools? Some corporate model, it's really light and flexible, uses a lot of online learning. Your kid only has to go to actual physical class, maybe 12, 15 hours a week. They have lots of opportunities in some kind of a community center that's organized in and together with the school to do things like sports and social engagement and so on. But it's mostly online, where of course they're still getting data mined because it's owned by a corporation and nobody's told them no yet. But it's also, let's say, 60% of the cost of public school. And so you pay your taxes, the taxes come back to you, the state takes 10%, they give you 90% of your money back, that's the deal in Arizona. And here's this new school that they're just popping up everywhere, and they cost 60% of public school, and you get to put that 30% back in your pocket to go buy whatever you need to buy for your kids or take a vacation or whatever else. Wow, win, win, win all the way around, except now you have the possibility of something coming in that's going to price out every other possible school except the elite private schools that have their funding for other reasons for a different market. And when you have a monopoly take over, maybe there's 10 brands, but they're all owned by the same corporation. On top, what you now have is that your state is forcing you to pay a lot of money and then giving you most of your money back so that you can spend it on one particular or two particular corporations that you're mandated to spend it on because they have now squeezed out the competition. Like when Walmart comes to a town and then there are no other stores, imagine when the schools are owned by one big corporation that has all this economies of scale and they squeeze out every other school in the market except for the elite privates that are in a different league for a different reason. Stopping monopoly capital from capturing that, because I guarantee you those schools are going to be ESG compliant and SEL equipped just like the public schools will be because their corporate masters and financiers say that they have to be. Figuring out how to block the monopoly capital problem is another thing that literally zero has been thought through. Now let me give you some heebie-jeebies and please tell me security's still here. There is a metric F-ton of money in the school choice lobby, and I would imagine that most of the people in that lobby want to make money off of what they're lobbying for because that's what lobbying is for. So if you don't think this model already exists, get on your phone and look up 4.0 schools and look up who's funding it. The model already exists, will be deployed rapidly once the policy is in place, and all of your education money, just like it went to Pfizer and Moderna, is going to go to a very small number of corporations who are paying something the state says you have to spend money on, and it's the only option in town. It can price out even the public schools. Very worried about launching into this without thinking it through. I'm not saying it's the wrong answer. I'm not saying it's part of the solution. I'm saying we are jumping off a bridge and we don't know how deep the water is when we hit it. And we should think a lot harder before we commit to that jump. Thanks.